Good morning from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. My name is Stephen Clark, editor of Spaceflight Now, and welcome to our live coverage of the launch of the Starlink 6-4 mission. You're looking live at two Falcon 9 rockets on the launch pads here on Florida Space Coast this morning. At the top is the Falcon 9 for this Starlink mission, which is now less than 54 minutes from launch. And then, weather permitting, later today at 12:12 p.m. Eastern Time, a Falcon 9 is poised for liftoff from Launch Complex 39A at Kennedy Space Center, just a few miles to the north of Pad 40, where the Falcon 9 is set to launch in less than an hour. That Falcon 9 from Pad 39A later today will be launching a resupply mission to the International Space Station. So SpaceX today is going for a launch doubleheader from here on Florida's Space Coast. They've tried to do this a few times before with launches spaced just a few hours apart, but technical issues or weather issues have gotten in the way of that, and SpaceX has not been able to pull off two launches in such a short time period from here in Florida yet, but they're going to go for it today with two Falcon 9s set to launch on two distinct missions from here in Florida. Again, the first launch is at 8:20 a.m. Eastern Time, or 12:20 UTC, with 22 Starlink internet satellites on board. And then less than 4 hours later, another Falcon 9 is set for liftoff from Pad 39A to carry more than 3.5 tons of supplies and cargo to the International Space Station. We're going to have two separate streams for you today. First, the one you're watching now is for the Starlink 6-4 mission. Once that mission wraps up, we'll take a quick break, and we'll be back later this morning around 11 a.m. Eastern Time to begin commentary and live coverage of this commercial cargo mission to the space station. Out at Pad 40, the Falcon 9 is being prepared for propellant loading, which should begin at T-minus 35 minutes. That's about 17 minutes from now. The weather forecast has dramatically improved throughout the morning. Now, SpaceX and the launch weather officer from the 45th Weather Squadron here at the Cape predict a 90% probability of acceptable weather for launch of the Falcon 9 on the Starlink 6-4 mission. No update on the weather just yet for the CRS mission, the cargo mission 4 hours later. The forecast from yesterday called for just a 40% probability of good weather for that launch during the lunch hour today. But given the weather trend this morning, that may be improving as well. The Falcon 9 that you're seeing out on Pad 40 is 229.6 feet tall. That's about 70 meters in height. It's a two-stage launch vehicle, and buttoned up inside the payload fairing at the very top of the Falcon 9 are the 22 Starlink internet satellites. These Starlink satellites are part of SpaceX's upgraded model of Starlink spacecraft with higher capacity, improved antennas, and improved propulsion system. These satellites are much larger and heavier than the previous generation of Starlink satellites that you may be familiar with. This is just the fourth launch of these upgraded Starlink satellites, and the 87th SpaceX launch overall, primarily dedicated to the Starlink network. After liftoff, the Falcon 9 with these Starlink satellites on board will head off to the southeast from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. It'll fly just northeast of the Bahamas, and the first stage of the Falcon 9 will target a landing on one of SpaceX's drone ships. This one is named Just Read the Instructions. It's floating in the Atlantic Ocean northeast of the Bahamas, about 400 miles or more than 600 kilometers downrange. So we're now inside of 15 minutes until the start of propellant loading. SpaceX's team at Pad 40 lifted the Falcon 9 vertical about 3:20 a.m. this morning local time, about 4 hours ago, in preparation for this morning's launch opportunity. That was a little later than anticipated. Some of the preparations apparently were running behind schedule overnight. And because of that, SpaceX elected to target a later launch time. They actually had 4 distinct launch times available for this mission this morning. Originally, it was targeted for a time before sunrise, a little before 6 a.m. Eastern Time. Now it's scheduled for 8:20 a.m. Eastern, 12:20 UTC. Now, 38 minutes from SpaceX's target launch time, which is 8:20 a.m. Eastern Time, 12:20 UTC. We're not yet receiving any updates from SpaceX Launch Control. They typically provide audio to us during the final 30 to 45 minutes of the countdown. That hasn't started yet, so we don't know whether the launch team has been polled for their go or no-go to proceed into propellant loading, which is now due to begin in less than 3 minutes' time. So at this time, if the launch remains scheduled for 8:20 a.m. Eastern Time, the SpaceX Launch Control Team should be going through or nearing the end of their electronic readiness poll. If you're just joining us and haven't done so yet, please hit the thumbs up or the like button here on our YouTube stream. That helps us out a lot by attracting more viewers through the YouTube algorithm. We want as many people watching our live launch coverage today as possible. And if you click the thumbs up or the like button, you can help us do that. SpaceX's countdown is just past the T-minus 35-minute mark for this target launch time of 8:20 a.m. Eastern Time. However, we're not getting any updates yet from SpaceX on the status of the countdown, so we are unable to confirm right now whether SpaceX has started propellant loading as they should have 40 seconds ago. So we'll stand by for updates from SpaceX or a visual indication in the next few minutes on whether any frost or venting or condensation appears around the first stage. That'll be a telltale sign of the start of propellant loading, but that's likely not to be visible for another couple of minutes. 31 minutes, 15 seconds, and counting. SpaceX's mission audio feed has started, so we should be hearing some voices from launch control in the next few minutes. But SpaceX's audio stream came up a little late, so we missed the call for the start of propellant loading. We presume that has started, but we're going to be watching the launch pad closely in the next couple of minutes to see if we see any venting vapors or any other sign that the cryogenic liquid oxygen is being loaded aboard the vehicle. "30 minutes, 20 seconds, and counting." We are indeed seeing some vapors around the first stage of the Falcon 9 rockets, so there's visual confirmation that propellant loading has started. So that started about 5 minutes ago, and the countdown appears to be on track for launch at 8:20 a.m. Eastern Time, or 12:20 UTC, with this next batch of 22 Starlink satellites. The weather forecast is 90% go, so a 90% probability of acceptable conditions at liftoff time. SpaceX did report a little earlier this morning that they're watching upper-level winds. Upper-level winds are not factored into that probability, so we'll see how those winds shake out as we approach launch time. "27 minutes, 20 seconds, and counting until the launch of SpaceX's Starlink 6-4 mission. This mission will be launching 22 upgraded Starlink satellites. These satellites are known as the Starlink V2 Mini, or version 2 Mini design. This is an intermediate design that SpaceX has developed for the Starlink network in between the older generation called version 1.5 and the next generation full-size version 2, which will launch on SpaceX's Starship. So these satellites, the V2 Mini, the Mini refers to it's a miniature design of the full-size V2. However, they are significantly larger and heavier than the older version 1.5 satellites. Each of these satellites weighs about 800 kilograms, or about 1,760 pounds. And they have 2 solar panels that will unfurl to a wingspan of about 100 feet or 30 meters, whereas the previous iteration of Starlink satellites have a single solar panel about half that length. There's also an upgrade to the propulsion system. This batch of satellites, each of these spacecraft is fitted with argon Hall thrusters for in-orbit maneuvers. SpaceX builds the Starlink satellites up in Redmond, Washington at the Starlink factory. The Falcon 9 rocket for this mission will be targeting an orbit about 200 miles or 320 kilometers above the Earth at an inclination of 43 degrees to the equator. So these satellites will pass between parts of the Earth between 43 degrees north and south latitude. Launching these satellites into that orbit really accelerates Starlink capability and coverage over the equatorial regions of the Earth. The Starlink coverage began covering higher inclination and polar regions first, and as they near global coverage, the focus is on expanding coverage in lower equatorial regions, lower latitude regions, where a significant portion of Earth's population lives. So these Starlink satellites, again, 22 of these are on this mission, whereas the older, smaller generation of Starlink satellites, in that case, SpaceX can launch more than 50 per shot on a Falcon 9 rocket. Here's a side-by-side comparison so you can get a feel for the differences in these satellites. On the left is a file photo from a previous mission of what a stack of more than 50 of these Starlink version 1.5 satellites looks like during encapsulation inside the Falcon 9's nose shroud. On the right is a stack of these larger version 2 mini satellites. As you can see, they are significantly larger. You can see the stack there of about 21 of these satellites. This is from a previous mission. There are 22 on today's launch. So you get a good feel for the size difference, the diameter difference as well, and the visual appearance of the Starlink V2 mini satellites in this side-by-side comparison. The version 2 mini satellites have 4 times the capacity or throughput of the older version 1.5 satellites. SpaceX, with this design, has introduced E-band communications for backhaul. They also, each of these satellites has enhanced phased array antennas. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the propulsion system is also modified. On the version 2 mini satellites, SpaceX is using argon Hall thrusters, which have higher thrust and higher efficiency than the older generation Krypton thrusters on the previous design of Starlink satellites. Argon also has the added benefit of it's less expensive to procure than Krypton, and SpaceX is deploying thousands of these satellites, and at that scale, the difference in cost of these fuels is notable, and SpaceX has made that decision to go with a less expensive, higher thrust, higher efficiency fuel for propulsion on these upgraded satellites. So the version 2 mini satellites are 2.6 times heavier and have 4.4 times the surface area of the older version 1.5 satellites. This is the 4th launch that SpaceX has flown with these upgraded satellites, and the 87th dedicated Starlink launch overall. We're back to a full screen view of pad 40. 22 minutes, 40 seconds now remaining in the countdown. Due to the launch time and the orientation of our camera, we're looking off to the east at the Falcon 9, about 4 miles away from the pad in this camera view. The rocket is somewhat backlit, so you may have a difficult time noting the frost line on the first stage. Normally you can see that frost line move up the first stage as the liquid oxygen tank is loaded. Liquid oxygen is chilled down to a few hundred degrees below zero. That causes that ice and frost to accumulate on the first stage of the Falcon 9. But in this view, you can see the vapors from the condensed air around the Falcon 9 becoming more prominent as propellants continue flowing into the vehicle.
Stage 2 locks RP1 load complete.
Now, less than 20 minutes remaining in SpaceX's countdown. We're now seeing the big vent from the strongback out at pad 40. We also just heard the call from SpaceX Launch Control that the second stage fuel tank, the kerosene tank on stage 2, has been fully loaded. This is the first of the 4 propellant tanks to be filled for flight. Both stages of the Falcon 9 will consume a mixture of kerosene and liquid oxygen on today's mission. The kerosene is known as RP1, or Rocket Propellant 1. It's a highly refined variety of kerosene that has fewer impurities in it than other types of fuel, such as that used on aircraft. The liquid oxygen, the oxidizer, is a cryogenic fluid. And the vent you're seeing now at pad 40 is associated with the start of chill down of the liquid oxygen transfer line going up to stage 2. So right now the first stage is being loaded with liquid oxygen and kerosene. Kerosene fully loaded on stage 2, and liquid oxygen will begin flowing into stage 2 in about 2 minutes. Everything looks to be on schedule for an 8:20 a.m. launch of the Falcon 9 rocket. "17 minutes, 30 seconds remaining until liftoff. If you haven't done so yet, please hit the thumbs up or the like button here on our YouTube stream. That really helps us out as we want to attract more viewers to our launch coverage. We should see that vent at pad 40 terminate in the next few moments, and looks like it is now ending. That coincides with the start of liquid oxygen loading on the second stage.
Stage 2 lock load has started.
And that voice from SpaceX Launch Control confirms that the second stage liquid oxygen loading has started. This is the last propellant tank to be filled this morning. In parallel with the kerosene and liquid oxygen loading, SpaceX has been loading cryogenic helium into the Falcon 9 as well. The helium is used to maintain pressure inside the propellant tanks as the propellants are consumed in flight. T-minus 15 minutes, 34 seconds and counting. Here's a look at the launch cadence here on Florida Space Coast over the last 20 years or so. This morning's mission will be the 27th space launch attempt of the year from Florida Space Coast. This includes flights from Kennedy Space Center and Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. Last year, there were 57 orbital launch attempts from the Cape. So the launch rate this year is on pace to slightly exceed that number at the current rate. And you can see the very quick uptick in the launch cadence over the last 5 years or so here, primarily due to SpaceX, which is labeled here in blue. The blue bars here are SpaceX launches. The Falcon 9 out on pad 40 is 229 feet or 70 meters tall. It's a two-stage launch vehicle. The first stage is flying for the 5th time. The upper stage, as is the case with every Falcon 9 launch, is brand new. It's the only major part of the rocket that is not reusable. The structure just to the right of the Falcon 9 is called the strongback. It also is the transporter erector, so that's the structure that carries the Falcon 9 horizontally from its hangar out to the pad and then raises it vertical with hydraulic pistons in preparation for liftoff. And on each side of the Falcon 9 are 2 lightning towers, for a total of 4. These masts are in place to protect the Falcon 9 from a direct hit from lightning. No lightning this morning here on Florida Space Coast. Weather here looks really great for launch. SpaceX is monitoring upper-level winds, though. The 45th Weather Squadron from the U.S. Space Force here at the Cape regularly sends up weather balloons throughout every countdown to monitor wind direction and speed at various levels in the atmosphere. And then that data is handed over to the launch provider, in this case SpaceX, which runs that data through models to ensure that the Falcon 9 rocket can safely steer through any wind shears, any abrupt changes in speed and direction of the winds at different altitudes, and also make sure the Falcon 9 structural limits are not exceeded by those winds. 12 minutes, 10 seconds now remaining in the countdown. Here's a look at the countdown timeline. The auto sequence began at 35 minutes. That also coincided with the start of propellant loading. And then at 16 minutes, a few minutes ago, we heard confirmation that liquid oxygen loading had started on stage 2. So we're now well into propellant loading at this point. The next major milestone will be coming at 7 minutes before liftoff with the start of engine chill down. That's when the 9 Merlin 1D engines at the bottom of the booster will be thermally conditioned for flight. The liquid oxygen in the first stage tank will be bled into those engines very slowly to bring down the temperature of all those components, all those pipes and plumbing, all that plumbing in the engine compartment down to cryogenic temperature. That protects those elements from the risk of damage from thermal shock as the rapid flow of liquid oxygen enters the engine chambers at engine startup. At about 5.5 minutes remaining in the countdown, kerosene should be fully loaded into the vehicle. At 4.5 minutes, the strong back will begin reclining to an angle of about 1.5 degrees from the Falcon 9 rocket. And then at T-minus 2 minutes, liquid oxygen loading will be terminated. At that point, the Falcon 9 will be fully loaded with about 1 million pounds of propellant. And then at 60 seconds in the countdown, control of the countdown will be handed over from the ground computer to the Falcon 9's flight computer. And in that final minute, we expect to hear SpaceX's launch director give their go for launch. The propellant tanks will be brought up to flight pressure, and then the engine ignition command will be issued by the onboard computer at 3 seconds. Here's a look at the flight track this morning. The Falcon 9, as is the case with a lot of these recent Starlink missions, will be heading southeast from Space Launch Complex 40. We've labeled the location of Slick 40 here on this map. The red line shows the approximate ground track. It'll be passing just northeast of the Bahamas, northeast of the Turks and Caicos, and then just off to the east of Puerto Rico over the Caribbean, heading off ultimately into the Atlantic Ocean and into orbit. We've also labeled the position of the drone ship, the football field-sized landing platform where the first stage will be targeting touchdown about 8.5 minutes into the flight. And here's a look at the launch sequence. It'll take about 1 hour and 5 minutes for the Falcon 9 to do its job this morning. That's the time from liftoff until deployment of the 22 Starlink satellites into orbit. The first stage will fire for about 2.5 minutes before separating and beginning its arc downrange toward the drone ship, where landing would occur about 8.5 minutes after launch. During that first stage descent, the upper stage will be firing its single engine to enter a parking orbit around the Earth, a very low altitude orbit, and then it'll coast halfway around the world and then over the Indian Ocean off the coast of Australia. At about 54 minutes into the flight, the upper stage will relight its engine for a very short burst of about 2 seconds to circularize the orbit, and that will set the stage for Starlink separation, the deployment of these 22 satellites at 1 hour and 5 minutes into the flight. We're now back full screen, looking at pad 40, 8 minutes 35 seconds until liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. Everything looking good so far. Seven minutes 50 seconds until launch. The next major milestone will be coming at 7 minutes in the countdown. That'll be engine chill down on the first stage.
Engines are chilling in.
SpaceX Launch Control just confirmed the start of engine chill down, so the countdown is proceeding for the target launch time of 8:20 a.m. Eastern Time, 12:20 UTC. If you're just joining us, my name is Stephen Clark. I'm the editor of Spaceflight Now. Welcome to our live coverage. Camera views are being provided by Adam Bernstein and Stephen Young here at Kennedy Space Center. We're now 6 minutes, 15 seconds until liftoff. Everything continues to look good for launch. Weather is favorable. No update yet on upper level winds. That was something that was being watched by SpaceX a little earlier this morning.
Stage 1 RP1 load complete.
And SpaceX just confirmed that the first stage kerosene tank has been fully loaded, so about 45,000 gallons of rocket-grade kerosene has been loaded into the vehicle. Both of the fuel tanks on stage 1 and stage 2 are full. Liquid oxygen loading will continue for about another 4 minutes or so.
Tanks pressing for strong back retract.
The countdown is just past 5 minutes until liftoff. The next step will be the retraction of the strong back at pad 40.
Strong back retract has started.
As the strong back begins retracting, here's a look at the flight history for this first stage booster. This booster is number 1078 in SpaceX's inventory. It's flown twice before, both earlier this year in March and April, with the Crew 6 mission carrying a crew of 4 astronauts up to the International Space Station, as well as on April 28th, most recently, with a pair of O3B mPOWER broadband satellites for SES. And here's the target orbital parameters for today's mission. The Falcon 9's upper stage will be aiming to place these 22 Starlink satellites in an orbit 195 miles by 200 miles in altitude at an inclination of 43 degrees to the equator. Three minutes, 17 seconds and counting. The strong back, as you can see, has reclined to an angle of about 1.5 degrees from the Falcon 9 rocket. The next major milestone in the countdown will be the termination of liquid oxygen loading in about a minute or so. Also in the last couple of minutes, final checks of the autonomous flight termination system
Stage 1 lock load complete.
have been completed, as well as final configuration of the guidance, navigation, and control system on the Falcon 9. We just heard that the Stage 1 liquid oxygen load is complete. Stage 2 will be completed momentarily. One minute, 42 seconds and counting.
Stage 2 lock load complete.
SpaceX has just confirmed the completion of liquid oxygen loading on Stage 2, so Falcon 9 has been filled with 1 million pounds of propellant.
Ground gas closeouts.
Coming up on 1 minute in the countdown. T-minus 60 seconds. Falcon 9 is now transitioning to onboard control of the countdown.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
T-minus 45 seconds.
LD, go for launch.
The launch director has given his final go for liftoff. "30 seconds. T-minus 15. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Engine ignition. And liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket carrying 22 more Starlink internet satellites into orbit. Falcon 9 has cleared the lightning towers at pad 40. They'll be pitching over momentarily to head southeast out over the Atlantic Ocean. Let's listen to the sound of the Merlin engines. "1 minute, 44 seconds into the flight. We hope you enjoyed the sound from the 9 Merlin engines, 1.7 million pounds of thrust being generated by those kerosene-fueled engines. A good start to SpaceX's Starlink 6-4 mission, the first of 2 SpaceX missions planned today. 2 minutes into the flight now. Engine chill down has started on stage 2 in preparation for its ignition. We're now about 20 seconds remaining until main engine cutoff and staging. 10 seconds until staging. We have main engine cutoff. We appear to have staging and ignition of stage 2.
Stage separation confirmed.
We see visual confirmation of the engine plume on stage 2. Here's a view from the onboard camera from SpaceX, which has a few seconds of delay from real time. You can see the staging completed and second stage engine ignition confirmed there. More than 3 minutes now since launch. 3 minutes, 10 seconds since liftoff. Standing by for payload fairing separation.
Fairing separation confirmed.
And there's jettison of the payload fairing. It comes off in 2 clamshell halves, and that exposes the Starlink satellites to the space environment for the first time. Those 2 fairing halves will be descending back to Earth and they'll parachute into the Atlantic Ocean and will be recovered and reused. 3 minutes, 40 seconds into the flight. This is the 229th launch of a Falcon 9 rocket, 240th launch overall of SpaceX's Falcon rocket family, and the 38th SpaceX launch of the year. Falcon 9 ascended into a beautiful, clear morning sky here over Cape Canaveral. You can see in this view from SpaceX, a split screen on the left-hand side is a view from the aft-facing camera on stage 1, which has extended its grid fins and will be arcing toward the drone ship. It'll be descending back into the atmosphere in the next few minutes. Stage 2 is accelerating to orbital velocity, now at more than 6,000 miles an hour at 140 kilometers altitude and climbing on stage 2, which has these 22 Starlink satellites on board. Five minutes since liftoff. The first stage of the Falcon 9 is now descending back into the atmosphere. It's descended below the von Karman line, which is the internationally recognized boundary of space, below 100 kilometers, as it begins its descent through the atmosphere to target a landing on the drone ship. Just read the instructions, floating northeast of the Bahamas. Stage 2 continues firing its engine, heading into orbit with these 22 Starlink satellites on board. Now more than 6 minutes since liftoff, which occurred at 8:20 a.m. Eastern Time here at Cape Canaveral.
Stage 1 entry burn startup.
Standing by for the entry burn on stage 1. There's ignition of the entry burn on stage 1 using 3 of its engines to slow down as it dives deeper into the atmosphere. You can see the velocity meter on the lower left rapidly decreasing with this retro maneuver. There's entry burn shutdown.
Stage 2 FTSO saved.
Now less than 2 minutes until landing of the first stage on the drone ship. Seven minutes, 10 seconds since liftoff. SpaceX reports the first stage trajectory is nominal as it heads for the drone ship. Altitude now about 21 kilometers and descending on stage 1. Here's a map showing the locations of stage 1 and 2. Stage 1 continuing its descent to the drone ship. Stage 2 heading farther down range, heading into orbit.
Stage 1 transonic.
First stage is now decelerating below the speed of sound, descending under 6,000 meters or about 25,000 feet. "30 seconds until landing." This view now a split screen once again from SpaceX. The landing burn is underway. The center engine of those 9 engines on the first stage has ignited, slowing down for landing on the drone ship.
Stage 1 landing leg deploy. Stage 1 landing confirmed.
Falcon 9 has landed. Booster 1078 is on the drone ship, having settled into position on this vessel about 8.5 minutes after launching from Cape Canaveral. This is the third flight for this booster. Standing by for engine cutoff on stage 2.
SECO.
And there's SECO, second stage engine cutoff confirmed.
Nominal orbit insertion.
And SpaceX has called out nominal orbit insertion, so Falcon 9 and the 22 Starlink satellites are in their preliminary parking orbit. And as you see here from SpaceX, the first stage is rocking in the seas on the drone ship in the Atlantic Ocean northeast of the Bahamas. This is about 400 miles downrange from the Cape. The first stage, or the second stage rather, will be coasting in orbit for another 45 minutes or so before reignition. At T plus 54 minutes, it'll fly halfway around the world. And then a very short 2-second burst from the upper stage engine will circularize its orbit and put it into position for deployment of these 22 Starlink satellites. SpaceX is wrapping up their live coverage now, so we don't expect any more live video from the Falcon 9 for the remainder of the mission. We'll keep this map up live. This is a map provided by SpaceX showing the location of stage 2 as it continues its circuit of the Earth. Now 44 minutes until the next major event in the mission, which will be the reignition of the stage 2 engine, followed by Starlink separation at 1 hour and 5 minutes into the flight. That will be at 9:25 a.m. Eastern Time. So at that point, the mission, in terms of the launch vehicle, will be complete, and SpaceX will be able to chalk this up as a success, assuming these next major milestones go well. "12 minutes since the launch of SpaceX's Starlink 6-4 mission. Just to recap, we saw liftoff of the Falcon 9 rocket at 8:20 a.m. Eastern Time from Pad 40 here at the Cape. That's 12:20 UTC for those of you in other time zones. This is the first of 2 Falcon 9 missions SpaceX has planned today from Florida Space Coast, just a few miles north of Pad 40. Another Falcon 9 is being prepared for launch from Pad 39A. Here's a look at that launch pad live right now, where the Falcon 9 is vertical in preparation for liftoff at 12:12 a.m. Eastern Time, or 16:12 UTC, with a cargo mission heading to the International Space Station. This is an unpiloted Cargo Dragon spacecraft at the top of the Falcon 9. If it launches today, it will dock at the International Space Station on Tuesday morning, delivering more than 7,200 pounds of supplies and experiments, and notably 2 new roll-out solar arrays to upgrade the space station's electrical system are also on board this Cargo Dragon spacecraft in the trunk section, the rear cargo bay of the capsule. 2 spacewalks are planned later this month by astronauts Steve Bowen and Woody Hoberg on the space station to install those 2 solar arrays. We're going to be covering that launch on a separate stream beginning around 11 a.m. Eastern Time or 1500 UTC, a little more than an hour before the target launch time. We haven't got an updated weather forecast for this mission. The weather has been trending more favorable than expected this morning, so there seems to be a realistic shot of getting this mission off the ground weather-wise. The weather forecast coming into today was not so optimistic, with just a 40% chance of good weather. Before we sign off from our live coverage of Starlink 6-4, let's take a look at the mission stats. This was the 229th launch of a Falcon 9 rocket, the 240th launch overall with the Falcon rocket family, including Falcon 9, Falcon Heavy, and Falcon 1. This was the 3rd launch for this booster, number 1078, the 127th SpaceX launch from Pad 40, and the 182nd launch overall from Space Launch Complex 40, including its previous use as a launch site for the Air Force's Titan rocket program. And here's a look at some of the upcoming launches from sites around the world, beginning just in a few hours' time with the launch of a Falcon 9 rocket from Launch Complex 39A here at Kennedy Space Center in Florida on the CRS-28 mission. This is the Commercial Resupply Services 28 mission heading to the space station with 7,200 pounds of cargo on board. Following that, SpaceX has another Falcon 9 being prepared for launch from Pad 40 once again on June the 9th with another batch of Starlink internet satellites. And then next week, June the 12th, the next Falcon 9 launch from Vandenberg Space Force Base is scheduled. This will carry a batch of government and commercial satellites, small sats, into orbit on SpaceX's Transporter 8 mission. This is the 8th SpaceX small satellite rideshare mission. And then later in the month, on June the 16th, the final flight of Europe's Ariane 5 rocket is scheduled to take off from the Guyana Space Center in South America, carrying a German communications satellite and a military communications satellite into orbit. The Syracuse 4B satellite is for the French military. The Heinrich Hertz satellite is for the German government. This will be the final flight of Europe's workhorse Ariane 5 rocket, which has been in service since 1996. We'll leave you with one last live look at the empty launch pad, Space Launch Complex 40, where the Falcon 9 departed about 16 and a half minutes ago to begin its mission with these 22 Starlink satellites. We're still nearly an hour away from the mission being complete with the separation of the 22 satellites, but we're going to wrap up our live commentary coverage now. We'll continue streaming mission audio on our Launchpad live stream, so please head over there for continuing coverage of the rest of these milestones, culminating in separation of the 22 Starlink satellites from the Falcon 9 upper stage at 9:25 a.m. Eastern Time. And then again, one more reminder, later this morning we'll resume our live coverage on a different stream for the CRS-28 cargo mission, scheduled to launch on another Falcon 9 at 12:12 p.m. Eastern Time. So until then, I'm Stephen Clark with Spaceflight Now. I want to thank Stephen Young and Adam Bernstein for their production and camera support this morning for this launch. We'll see you in a few hours' time for the next SpaceX launch from here on Florida's Space Coast.